Hello, hi. Hi, and welcome to the webinar for Celebrate Cycling, Perspectives on Health, Growth and Transition. My name is Allison Phillips and I am the Green School's Cycling Development Officer. So the topic of celebrating cycling could not be more relevant today, but we'll have more on that later. So to get us going, just to focus on a few bits of housekeeping. So you can see you have your Q&A and your chat boxes there. Feel free to pop your name and organization if you'd like into the chat box. Once we get going, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in as they come to the top of your head, because we'll be able to answer questions as we go along after each presenter. So also just to keep in mind, we are recording now, so we can send this out to you later on. So in the background, we have Jessica also working with us. She's another travel officer at Green Schools. So she is going to be helping you out on the chat box and in the Q&A. So if you need anything there. Also for our Q&A box, if you have any similar questions to things that people have already asked, you can like some questions and that'll bring it to the top and we'll know that it's something to address. All right, so this is our very first public webinar, so we're very excited to have all of you here, and we hope it all goes well. Okay, so I am going to... Great. Okay, so on to some content here. So a little bit about Green Schools and what it does in relation to cycling. So Green Schools Travel is funded by the National Transport Authority. So we have 25 travel officers all around the country that work directly with schools working on the travel and global citizenship travel themes. So what travel officers usually would be doing with schools in relation to cycling would be cycle training directly with the school's pupils and students, or getting gear training for parents, the staff, the teachers. So it's great training for all the people in the school environment. Also, the travel officers would provide grants to the schools to get Cycle Right training. So Cycle Right is the national standard in cycle training. So we provide grants to children to take part in that. We also provide cycle and scooter parking to schools. You can see last year we had quite a bit of scooter and cycle parking in schools all over the country. We also can do bike maintenance workshops, a cyclability audit of the school to see how safe and feasible cycling might be in the area. And we also help promote cow days. So that's cycling on Wednesday, not cow days. So we have our cow days, lots of schools take part in that, especially in June. It's a big bike month. So we also have ongoing research, which you'll hear a little bit more about. So we have research going on currently about the gender gap in cycling for teenage girls in secondary school. So most of the time, my audience as a travel officer would be in primary and secondary schools talking to students and pupils about their journey to and from school. So I completely recognize children and students aren't in this alone. They have their families, they have their communities, they have their friends. So it's so important to consider the wider community, everyone that's involved. So it's why we're all here today. It's so important to get families and communities in on the conversation, getting to and from school, because at the end of the day, we all want to promote sustainable transport on as many journeys as possible. So today we have three different perspectives on cycling. So in order of presentation, first we have Dr. Robert Egan. So Dr. Egan's research focuses on issues of entitlement to public spaces, experiences of vulnerability, and utility cycling in Dublin. So Dr. Egan currently works at Green Schools as a secondary school officer, and he continues his research as a part of the And She Cycles campaign, exploring the school cycling gender gap amongst teenagers in second level. Maybe Robbie can say hi there.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
Perfect. All right, so that's Robbie. Next, we have Hugh Cooney, who is both the CEO and founder of BleeperBikes, Ireland's first stationless bike sharing scheme, currently operating over 500 bikes in Dublin. So Hugh will discuss some of the recent increases in registration and cycling in relation to bike sharing. Do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Perfect. All right. And then finally, we will hear from Dr. Damien Tuama, who wears a few hats. He is the National Cycling Coordinator with Cyclist.ie and Taisce. Since 2016, Dr. Tuama has been the Vice President of the European Cyclist Federation. His doctoral research was conducted at Trinity College Dublin, where he explored the nature of transitions in mobility systems with a case study in Dublin. The case study was focused on the ripple effects ensuing when a bike sharing system is introduced in a capital city. So interesting stuff. He's worked in mobility, planning and tourism for over 20 years and currently divides his time between advocacy, consultancy and teaching. Do you want to say hi there, Damien?
Hi, Allison. Good afternoon, everybody.
Perfect. Sorry, we were stuck on Robbie there for a second, but we have Hugh and we have Damien. All right, so I might pass over to Robbie and we can hear about his research.
Thanks, mate, Allison. I'm just going to share my screen now. Right. So welcome everyone. Thanks Damien for coming to this webinar. I'm hoping that today what I talk about will be interesting and a bit informative as well. And maybe we'll give you a kind of wider perspective on the health impacts of cycling. So yeah, so today what I'm going to talk about then is the kind of some of the research evidence to do with cycling and risk, but more importantly, cycling and public health. And basically argue that the health benefits of cycling far outweigh the health risks. So, cycling is risky. So we often hear that people who don't cycle consider cycling as risky, and indeed people who do cycle may perceive cycling to be a risky mode. And what does the evidence say? Some important reports on cycling say. So the OECD Cycling Health and Safety Report published in 2013, this was a report that looked at the relative risk of cycling, the risk of cycling relative to car occupancy or driving or as a passenger. And it included data from the UK, the US, Switzerland, New Zealand, as well as many other countries. So importantly, it included data from countries with low levels of ridership, not just countries with high levels of ridership. And what was reported in this particular report is that there was a higher risk of road crash related casualties. So that included injuries and or fatalities per unit of exposure, which could be measured in terms of per billion trips, per billion minutes, per billion kilometers, and other metrics for cyclists compared to drivers. So overall then, they reported that in some cases, there could be as much as 10 times the risk of road crash related casualties for cycling versus drivers. But what does this actually account to in terms of comparing to other countries? So in Ireland, one particular report, Castro, Calmeyer and Gocci 2018, reported that there's roughly a 1.8% fatality rate for cycling per 100 million kilometers in Ireland. So compared to the Netherlands, it's about 0.8% for that exact same level of exposure in the Netherlands. So on one count then, cycling can be considered to some extent to be more risky than driving or car occupancy. What's another area that's looked at in terms of the claim that cycling is risky? Air pollution. So Bigazzi and Figliozzi conducted a systematic review. So they did a review of some of the high quality or decent quality evidence looking at air pollution exposure and intake, comparing cyclists to drivers. So in this particular systematic review, they reported that in terms of exposure concentration, so that's about the concentration of our exposure to different kinds of air pollutants, was highly dependent on the context when you're comparing cyclists versus drivers. So in some contexts, cyclists would have higher levels of exposure concentration to air pollutants, in others, drivers, in other contexts, quite similar levels of exposure. But what was crucial to this is that it was highly dependent on the context. So if it was a windy context, if there was levels of segregated cycling infrastructure versus integrated infrastructure, etc. But no clear conclusions really. But however, what was clearly reported is that there was higher levels of air pollution intake or air pollutant intake dose for cyclists relative to drivers. So this was largely accounted for due to the higher respiration rate of cyclists, so roughly between 2 to 5 times higher than when you're a driver. So on another count, then cycling can be described to some extent to be risky from the point of view of air pollution to some extent. However, when you're looking at the public health impact of a particular mode of travel, you don't just consider the risks, you consider the benefits as well. So that leads us to ask, what about physical activity? So epidemiology, I'm going to talk about a few epidemiological studies that have looked at the public health impact of cycling. And what epidemiology is, basically as a discipline, is essentially the study and analysis of the distribution and determinants of health and illness. And some of the major variables explored in relation to cycling and health are the measures of all-cause mortality, so death by any cause, cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular fitness, obesity, and diabetes. So Anderson et al. In 2000 did a longitudinal study in Copenhagen that was carried out over about 14.5 years, beginning in the 70s and ending in 1994. And this looked in particular at all-cause mortality, so death by any cause, comparing rates between cyclists and non-cyclists. And longitudinal studies in general, they involve more than one point of data collection. So you may have the same group with multiple points of data collection over a prolonged period of time. So what they reported with 6,000 men and roughly 800 women cyclists in the total sample was that cycling to work was associated with 28% less likelihood of death by any cause between the 2 points of data collection. And this particular estimate was controlled for different variables that could confuse the estimate, such as physical activity outside of cycling, BMI, levels of blood lipids, etc. And interestingly, this particular calculation was statistically significant in its relationship, so highly related then for men, but not for women. Another longitudinal study then that was particularly large is the Shanghai Women's Health Study carried out between 1997 and 2004. And this study had around roughly 67,000 participants, all women this time, and they reported, similar to Anderson et al., an inverse relationship between utility cycling exposure and all-cause mortality between 21 to 33%, so similar to 28%. Interestingly, this study, in contrast to Anderson et al., was actually statistically significant, highly statistically significant, potentially because of the high level of women cycling that could be analysed in it, with over 67,000 participants. I'm not sure how many women cyclists were included in that, but it would have been much higher than the Anderson et al. Study. And once again, this was controlled for different variables that could actually affect the outcome, such as physical activity, chronic medical conditions, age, and other factors. One particular fascinating point about this study is that there was no statistically significant inverse relationship found for walking and all-cause mortality. So this suggests that potentially there's a particularly beneficial effect in terms of prevention of mortality, looking at cycling in particular. So Kelly et al. 2014 conducted a systematic review. So once again, similar to Bigazzi and Figliozzi, a review of some of the seminal studies in a particular research area, looking at cycling exposure and all-cause mortality once again. And within this systematic review, they carried out what's called a meta-analysis. So an independent analysis of data gathered from other studies. So they included some data from the Anderson et al. Study and the Matthews et al. Study. And the benefit of this is that you can gather data from many different studies from many different contexts, not just high cycling contexts like Copenhagen and Shanghai. And what they found, estimating using a standard dose of cycling, which in here I have 11.25 metabolic equivalent hours per week, which is basically between 1 and 101 minutes of cycling per week, that there was a 10% reduced risk of all-cause mortality adjusted for physical activity. So once again, but instead drawing from many different contexts, there was once again evidence that the cycling is associated with less chance of death by any cause. And one particular relationship as well was discovered in this particular study, and that's that there was a nonlinear dose-response relationship between cycling and all-cause mortality. So that what that means is per a particular dose of cycling, So in this case, between 0 to 11.5 metabolic equivalent hours, or between 1 minute and 101 minutes cycling per week, this was found to be the best category in terms of preventative benefits in terms of all-cause mortality for cycling. So those who cycled more than 101 minutes wouldn't necessarily have the same benefit of those who may have cycled 0 to 1 minute per week of cycling. So this suggests once again that those who are transitioning from car use could benefit the most in terms of preventative health benefits from cycling. Another study, systematic review also, Oja et al. Looked at not just all-cause mortality, but other markers of health and illness. So they found a inverse dose-response relationship between all-cause mortality and cycling, once again adding to the evidence. But they also found inverse relationships for cardiovascular disease, colon cancer, overweight and obesity, and also not just preventative health benefits, but increased cardiovascular fitness too, evidence for increased fitness. So the last study I'll look at then is Pouchet et al. 2010. So this, unlike some of the other studies, which were systematic reviews and longitudinal studies involving multiple points of data collection, this was a cross-sectional analysis of cross-sectional data. So a single point in time where a measurement was taken, not multiple points in time. And the benefit of this is that data was gathered from many different countries, 14 countries, including all 50 US states. Many of these countries, once again, potentially very hostile to cycling. And what was reported overall was that countries with higher rates of cycling exhibited statistically significant higher levels of recommended levels of physical activity and statistically significant lower levels of self-reported obesity and diabetes. So having looked at quite a bit of evidence quite quickly, I apologize for the speed, we can conclude, I think, that cycling isn't necessarily risky, but cycling is actually remarkable. So cyclists may live longer, with evidence of between 10 to 33% less likelihood of death than non-cyclists over a given period of time, less risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, colon cancer, overweight and obesity, higher cardiovascular fitness, greatest benefit for the sedentary or the relatively sedentary, health benefits of cycling far outweigh the health risks. So this is based on what we've looked at, but indeed there's a lot of statistical modeling studies which have a different approach than epidemiological studies that actually show even greater benefits than what I've talked about today. And then as well, mass cycling may increase the margin of benefit through decreased cars. So the first two risks we looked at, road crash related casualty and air pollution, can both be decreased with increased levels of cycling. So with more cycling may come even greater health impacts. And this is all really good news and evidence for, or gives us good reason to celebrate cycling with evidence of an Irish cycling boom that later on my colleague Hugh Cooney will talk about. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Robbie. So you've given us a lot of really great information that kind of backs up things that a lot of us already know. We know cycling is good for you, good for your health, good to keep you fit, but now we have some kind of research and information to kind of back that up. So we have two questions. I might leave one of them for everyone to answer, all the panelists at the end to answer, but one question in particular I might have you answer now, Robbie, if that's okay. Quick fire. So in the Copenhagen study, why was there such a low number of women compared to men?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not actually sure because this all originates from my literature review for my PhD. And you can only, when you're looking at such a wide body of evidence, it's very hard to kind of look really in depth at one. But I would assume potentially that maybe in Copenhagen you had lower levels of cycling in general in the 70s. I don't know, maybe some of my colleagues could back me up on that. And that potentially when they were recruiting, there wasn't actually, it was probably much more gender activity than it is now in Copenhagen and other parts of that regions of that area. So I'd imagine maybe that's part of it. It wasn't necessarily a cycling city in the 70s. I think it was similar to the Netherlands, where you actually had a kind of growth of automobility. So potentially that explains part of it.
Great. Okay, perfect. So perfect answer. Nice and fast. I like it. So we are going to move on to Hugh to tell us a little bit about that cycling boom you were talking about. So Hugh, would you like to take over there?
Sure, I will indeed. I'm going to share my presentation now. That's showing up okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Robbie, for that great presentation. And as Robbie said, I'm going to talk a bit about the data and the boom we're seeing over the last few months. I'm going to start, though, by talking more generally, just to recap on bike sharing and specifically how it works, and then I'll talk a bit about the data and the boom that we're seeing. Just before I get started, I'd like to thank Allison and Jessica and the rest of the team at Green Schools for putting together this afternoon's webinar. So firstly, looking at just a background of bike sharing. So on the left here, we have the station-based approach that everybody will be familiar with. So Dublin Bikes is obviously a station-based scheme. And while it's been extremely successful, the downside is they're very expensive to build. So the stations themselves cost a lot of money, and the bikes are a relatively small component of the total capex spend. So that challenge resulted in various people trying to unlock a cheaper alternative to making bike sharing available. And that came to fruition in 2016 in China, where they came up with a smart lock concept that was permanently on the bikes rather than having a need for the stations. So BleeperBikes is part of the family of stationless bike schemes. And one slight modification for BleeperBikes on the model that first came out of China in 2016 was actually an initiative from Dublin City Council, where they insisted on a tethering cable being added to the bikes as well, so that our bikes are safely attached to a Sheffield stand. As there had been a lot of negative media from China in stationless bikes, while they're getting more people cycling, people were careless about where they were parking the bikes, and that was becoming an inconvenience to other road users. So Dublin City Council saw that, and in the bylaws that they introduced in 2017, they specifically insisted any stationless operator has a tethering cable. So that's just the background of the two models. So in terms of how our model works, for anyone who hasn't used it before, it's entirely app-based. So you start off by downloading the app. Once you have the app on your phone, all the bikes themselves inside the smart lock are GPS modules. So that's giving out the live location of the bike. So when you open up our app, it kind of defaults to your location on the map, and it will display any available Bleeper bikes in your proximity with an orange icon. And then a key aspect of it then, when you've cycled the bike, is to park correctly. So we have various measures within the app to make it easy for people to find available public bike racks near them, near to the destination. And then when they've actually parked up the bike and tethered our chain, we ask that they take a photo just as an extra measure to ensure that people have followed the tethering steps. So that's how it works. In terms of our operating area in Dublin, we define that as our purple zone. So this map here shows our existing purple zone, and it covers a 92 square kilometre footprint of Dublin. So we go south of Dublin, we stop at UCD. North of Dublin, we stop at DCU, and then we also go out to Howth and all the way up the coast to Malahide, and then going out westwards, we go all the way out to Ongar, which is a residential area just beside Blanchardstown Shopping Centre. So that's our operating zone, and customers must keep the bikes within that zone. So you're free to cycle wherever you want, but you must park at a public bike rack within the purple operating zone. And here's just an example of some pictures of how the bikes blend in with everyday privately owned bikes. As I said, it doesn't require expensive customized docking stations. It uses the same infrastructure as private bikes uses. So that's a background as in how BleeperBike works and bike sharing generally. And then moving on to some of the data we've seen over the last 3 to 4 months. So this chart represents our app downloads. So I mentioned that at the beginning, the bikes are accessible once you've downloaded our app. So in March 2017 was when we first released our app, and that one download was most likely me testing the app. And you can see how it kind of grew relatively slowly. June 2017 was when we first became operational. But you can see that the app downloads been relatively modest up until June 2018, where we had 6,862 downloads. That was the month at which we first were allowed under our license to operate within Dublin city centre. And you can see then from June 2018, the app downloads growing on a monthly basis. The level of growth was relatively consistent. Up until the end of the chart, where you can see in between April 2020 and May 2020, there was a huge growth in the total app downloads, where we saw we saw a monthly increase of 17,000 app downloads in May. In terms of just looking as it's so relevant to the times we're in at the moment, what our data showed us about where our bikes were getting used immediately before COVID-19, and kind of during March, where we were kind of half the month was affected by it and half wasn't, and then April, where the full month was affected by it. So February, this map shows the darker the line, the more BleeperBike trips were on the route. So up until COVID arrived, our busiest routes, and it's a little bit difficult at this level of zoom out, but I'll hover my mouse over. So this is Rathmines. So Rathmines into town was a hugely popular route for our users. Then the protected bike lane along the canal was also extremely popular for people going into work in Grand Canal Docks. And then you can see the dark red lines around Dame Street and College Green. And that was for up until February. Every month looked like that. They were always our busiest routes and reflective of people going from residential areas into business areas to work and then returning home in the evening. Then if I flick to the next slide and we see March, where you know, the lockdown came kind of halfway in the month. So it's still reflective of the busy route coming from Rathmines into town and the segregated bike lane. But you can see other areas beginning to get some activity, particularly suburban routes. So we're starting to see more activity in Phoenix Park here, and we're starting to see a bit more activity in Ongar and Blanchardstown, where if I go back to February, there was really very little, and it just started to commence a bit in March. But if I move then to the next slide, which is April, we can see how significantly this changed. So the dark red lines that we saw from Rathmines along the canal have kind of blended in with normal levels of activity, reflecting the fact that those trips were taken by people going to work, and people obviously weren't traveling to work throughout April. But we saw, you know, for that decline was compensated by a significant increase in leisure-based cycling. So this is Phoenix Park here. So Phoenix Park has become hugely popular for us, something we'd never seen before, as we were really primarily used by commuters. And then things really started to take off for us out in Ongar, between Ongar and Blanchardstown. And anyone who's familiar with the area, it's a very flat cycle and the segregated, this is the Ongar Distributor Road, and it's segregated, very flat, pleasant cycle. And that just surprised us as to how popular that has become. And then we saw that the route, the Clontarf cycleway, has also gotten a lot more popular for us in April compared to what we would have seen as a normal pattern before COVID. And to kind of look a little bit further at that, then this is May alone, where to put a bit of context in this, this is looking at the total BleeperBike rides in Fingal County Council in May, and there were 6,769 rides in the month. To put that in context, in February 2020 there was 360 rides in the whole of Fingal. In March 2020 there are 428. Then there was a big jump in April, which is, you know, for the entire month people were spending their time at home. It was 2,069 rides, and then it increased again threefold to over 6,000 in May. So reflective of the suburban increase in cycling. And just moving on, as I'm tight for time, so to also just say that there was also a significant increase in our social media in younger users. So previously we've been primarily used by professionals, but we've seen throughout the April and May period, we've become popular with a much younger user, and that's great to see. And obviously their familiarity and with app-based services, I guess BleeperBike was second nature to them. So we're delighted to see that while nobody is excited about the COVID period, there's been, at least we've benefited in younger people have become aware of us throughout this. So that's all I have to present, and I've just kind of finished off with a coupon here for anyone who hasn't used the service before. Go Green. If you download the app, we've created a coupon valid for the day. It's a day pass to use BleeperBike, so you just enter in Go Green and feel free to pass that on to friends or family, and you have till 25th of June until it will expire. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Hugh. Excellent. What the numbers don't lie. People love cycling. People love the independence, getting out there. We have a good few questions, so I'm going to jump straight into it. We're going to see as many as we can get for you, Hugh, in 3 minutes. Quick. So one question for you. It's kind of two questions rolled in, or two ideas in one. So Lucas says he loves BleeperBike and would love to see it expanded to other cities. And that's kind of, a few people have said similar things, maybe to Fingal, Donabate, Rush, Skerries. So start with that one.
Yeah, I suppose one thing we keep a close eye on is our operating area. So our purple zone at the moment is 92 kilometers squared. If we compare that to the footprint of the Dublin bike stations, that covers a 10 kilometer squared area. They have 1,500 bikes and we have 700 bikes. So if we stretch ourselves too thinly, we can't deliver a reliable service. So we'd love to cover, you know, as wide an area as possible, but it has to be demand based, and it also has to reflect the fact that we only have so many bikes. So hopefully that's something that will evolve over a couple of years, but we're already covering a fairly wide area given the number of actual bikes in our fleet.
Great. So this one kind of goes along the same lines of expanding. So this person is anonymous. They said, thanks, Hugh. I use BleeperBikes every time I visit Dublin. Very user-friendly, especially for the city centre. Do you have any ideas for how to serve more disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, I suppose for us, like it's, you know, there's disadvantaged communities already within our purple zone, and the fact that it's all app-based, it's a lot simpler maybe than the Dublin bike scheme with a membership card. There's less flexibility to introduce a way where you can give tiered pricing and discounts to different people. But with our coupon codes in our app, there's a variety of functionalities where people, based on having certain codes that were only made available to them, they could pay a reduced price. So it's definitely something that's relatively straightforward to do in an app-based service. I guess the administration of it would be just ensuring that genuine people were accessing it rather than people looking for a way to get a cheaper deal.
Great, and we have lots of questions, but I'm going to pick one more for now, and then we'll come back to them. So Trevor says he's noticed a lot more in Dublin 8 the use of bleeper bikes by teenage girls and younger girls. Do you have a gender split for the use of bleeper bikes?
We, under GDPR, we're not actually allowed to ask if a user is male or female. Reason being is you can only ask if it's relevant to delivering the service, and it's not relevant to hiring one of our bikes, whether you're male or female. So we can't actually ask that question, but we can using software come up with a pretty good guesstimate of whether our users are male or female. So I don't have that split based on our kind of up-to-date May statistics, but it is available, but it's not perfect because you can't ask the question directly.
Okay, thanks so much. We have loads more questions, but I want to hop over to Damien and we'll come back to the questions just after. So thanks so much, Hugh, and on to Damien there.
Can you hear me, Allison?
Yep, you're good to go.
Good to go. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here in my living room. And thank you very much to Allison and to Jessica for the kind introduction earlier on. So I want to say a little bit about transitions. And the question is often asked, are we in the middle of a transition at the moment to mass cycling? So I want to explore that topic over the next few minutes. It's going to be a quick run through transitions theory. So bear with me for a few minutes and then I'm going to apply it to what I think is happening at the moment. So what do we mean by transition? I mean, in general, you know, we can talk about post-communist states transitioning into, democratization. We can talk about transitions to low carbon energy systems. We can talk about transitions from sailing ships to steamships. So it's used, the term is used in lots of ways. I'm going to focus on the technology side of it. And I suppose one of the classic texts in science and technology studies is Hughes's book, Networks of Power. And it's an exploration of how systems of electricity grew and spread across the different continents in America and in France. And one of the key concepts is that there's a seamless web of artifacts, organizations, scientific elements. It's not just engineers and scientists, it's financiers, it's patents. So there's a lot of different elements that we need to think about together to understand the processes by which systems transition. And in short, they're non-linear complex processes. So it's not like the billiard balls on a snooker table where it's simple mechanics at play. They're very much complex processes. So how on earth do we study transitions if they're so complex? Well, it's a little bit like the COVID curve. It's a little bit like the COVID curve. You know you have gone past the peak when you're looking back. So it's easiest to study transitions in a historical context. It's a little bit difficult to study them when you think you might be in the middle of one at the moment. But you really need to use some different theoretical frameworks, conceptual frameworks, which are really ways to organize your ideas. And one that I made use of myself when I was exploring the ripple effects of introducing public bikes in Dublin is the multi-level perspective. And essentially, it's an analytical framework that's been used in lots of different studies. And it kind of divides the world into three. It divides the sphere of inquiry into three levels. You look at the niche, what's happening at the niche level, the new innovations, the new entrants, the new business models, you know, like the fourth generation public bike schemes that Hugh talked about. There's the regime level, which is, you know, the established practices, the policies and so forth. And then there's the landscape level, which is the macro exogenous level. So it's your economic system, it's your environmental conditions, and these are the slowest ones to change. So the essence of the framework is that transitions occur when you have some sort of external shock at a landscape level that weakens up the middle level, which is the established practices, and that allows the innovations to come through. And it's easiest seen in an image. And don't worry about the text in the image. But again, if you look at the top, that represents, you know, the big external elements. It's the economic conditions and so forth. Down the bottom, you have the new technologies, the new business practices, the new models emerging. They're coalescing. New actors get involved and they strengthen it. And then, if you like, they break through this window of opportunity, and they kind of break through into the mainstream. And I suppose what I'm interested in is the middle part of that diagram, and it's how that new technology intersects with policies, with infrastructure, with culture, with discourses, with media, with markets, and that's really the framework one can use to try and understand if a transition is happening. So what has that got to do with cycling? Well, I'm going to apply it now very quickly to cycling, and I'm going to show the image again. So in between those red dashes, this is the area I want to examine, and in particular, I'm interested in how a shock to the system, and for this exercise, we can think of the shock. We have climate change. There are major shifts happening at that macro level. There's the COVID pandemic, which is a classic example of a shock to the system. And possibly we also are having some sort of economic recession or depression or collapse. So there's lots happening at that macro level. So that's really fracturing or opening up, you know, the established practices in the middle. Then down the bottom, you have your new technology, such as Hugh's fabulous public bikes, bike sharing. So really there's opportunities which open up when people's habits have changed, when infrastructure is changing, and essentially you get a reconfiguration of the system as a result of those two things happening. So to bring it down to more tangible elements, if we look at the dimension of infrastructure, very quickly in Dublin in particular, but it's also happening in other places, you've had a very quick reallocation of road space as a result of this shock to the system. And you're getting new mobility habits developing, people trying out cycling for the first time. And of course, this is supported by, this just doesn't happen by itself. This is facilitated by, you know, really good advocacy. And we had great news during the week that the route from Blackrock down to Sandy Cove is going to be, it's going to have a two-way segregated cycle route, and really great credit is due to the volunteers who have made that happen. So that's on the infrastructure side. So what else is happening in this interesting period? So the two other elements I want to point to, on the left-hand side, we had our programme for government agreed by the three parties, not their memberships, but the parties during the week. And brilliantly for cycling, there's a commitment there, the 10% of the land transport budget, the total capital budget for transport will go to cycling, and 10 for pedestrian projects, which is really, really exciting. And it's what the European Cyclist Federation has been pushing for decades. And on the right-hand side of that image, you can see at the moment, the European Cyclist Federation as an advocacy organization is trying to capitalize on the opportunity opened up by COVID. So there will be 20 billion euro available for mobility projects, and the ECF is advocating that there will be 5 billion as a subsidy for e-bikes and cargo bikes, for example. So during this reconfiguration process, there are windows of opportunity which open up, which otherwise wouldn't be open. And as advocates, it's about identifying what the opportunities are and then advocating very, very systematically. So just one other concept, there's lots of really interesting concepts within the multi-level perspective and other transition frameworks. And I think system resilience and vulnerabilities is particularly timely at the moment, because our public transport system is under pressure, it's vulnerable, can't be used in a normal way. But on the other hand, our bicycle system is really resilient. It's a resilient system to have in a period of virus and pandemic. So systems thinking is a really useful way to think about how changes happen. I'm going to finish up then with this, one of my favorite images, and it's from the 2002 German Federal Ministry of Transport cycling plan. And it really thinks about cycling not just as a few cycle lanes here and there, a few bit of bike parking here and there. It's thinking in systems terms of what cycling is. And if we think back to the history of the development of automobility, which is all about, it's the supporting infrastructure, it's the petrol stations, we should think about cycling in the same way and think about all of the elements of the system, and that's what we're trying to bring about. So to go back to my question, are we in the midst of a transition? I think it's too early to say so, but there's some really interesting stuff happening by way of shifts in infrastructure, in terms of policy, budgets for cycling, and there's lots else happening, but I'm going to leave it at that because it's a big subject and I'm just trying to scrape the surface of it. So thank you very much. Very happy to take any questions, short ones or long ones.
Great, Damien. That really kind of brought it all together for us, what we've been talking about. So that was really useful information. Cycling is the way forward. So I am very lucky. What you mentioned there about the two-way cycle lane on the coast, I get to use that. I use that road every single day, so I'm delighted. So we have a couple new questions here so we'll have maybe one or two for you yourself, Damien, and then maybe we can open it up to all the speakers together to answer questions, because there was some from the beginning that might be good to get everyone's feedback. So the first question is about the PFG. If the Greens were to reject the current PFG, do you feel it would be a blow to cycling in Ireland, or can other parties do better? Is this the best we can hope for? It's probably a big answer there.
Yeah, I think if we just look at the transport portfolio, the programme for government is incredibly progressive. I mean, we've 10% for cycling, 10% for walking, and 2/3 of the remainder going to public transport for new projects. Now, there's some wiggle room around what's a new road project, what's a new public transport project, and there's some language which could be a bit tighter. Stuff should happen as opposed to must happen. But in general, it's incredibly progressive for transportation, for sustainable transport. On that basis, it definitely should be supported, but there are other domains that people are interested in, whether it's biodiversity or agriculture or energy generation or so forth. So transport-wise, it's very progressive.
Great. Okay, so we have another one here from another Allison Roberts. So she is thinking about how things are getting wider. So would you say that more small towns or more areas in the country are starting to get on board with the bike movement? Because a lot of it seems that it's still concentrated in Dublin. So she's just wondering, is it going to happen in smaller cities and towns too?
Yeah, I think that the development is definitely uneven. But I know Allison is from Clonakilty, and they have done amazing work with the Clonakilty Bicycle Festival, which is using creativity and different fun events and basically making campaigning and cycling fun and enjoyable. So I think when there's that community in a town and they're trying events, and this is actually the time to do it at the moment, And you're probably aware that the National Transport Authority, it does have a fund there to support local authorities, you know, with technical help, with financial help. So there is, it's a great time to encourage cycling at the moment. And you just need to, you know, join up with other groups. Like just in the last 2 weeks, we have a new cycle campaigning group in Navan. There's a new one emerging in Thurles. There's one in Drogheda. And that's in addition to the existing 25 groups within the Cyclist.ie network, and in addition to the brilliant work that Taisce are doing. So there's a lot happening, and it's a case of, you know, teaming up with people, working together and making it happen.
Great. Okay, and maybe one more directed just to yourself, Damien, and then we'll open it up. What are your thoughts for facilitating cycling in Irish towns with narrow streets?
I think if there are narrow streets, I think they will be a lot less narrow if you remove the car parking from them. So that might be removing the car parking, it might be removing the actual cars themselves. But I mean, there are so many European cities that have improved the quality of life, improved the sociability of the streets, improved the air quality, which Robert was talking about earlier on, through removing motorized transport. And it is the flip side. You want to provide dedicated cycle space, but any European city since the 1970s which have grown cycling, it has also been through removing car traffic, and we shouldn't be shy about saying that.
Great. Okay, so I might go to a gallery view so we can see everyone and we can ask some questions. Perfect. So a question for everyone there. So if we have about 5 minutes for some questions, and if we can't get to all of them, we can respond afterwards. So a question that was at the very beginning there that might be nice for whoever wants to answer. So what does everyone think about the new commitment to 1 million a day on mobility? Where would this best be spent?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think the first thing is continue to build the temporary cycle facilities and make them permanent. Reduce speed limits is probably one of the safest and best ways to promote cycling. It doesn't cost a lot of money and has a great impact. High quality bicycle parking everywhere is another easy and cheap one.
Do you want anyone else of us to answer, Allison?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I suppose like I wouldn't be like an expert in terms of promoting cycling, but I know quite a bit about like cycling and risk and what people's experiences of cycling are in Dublin and how they deal with them mainly. But I suppose like based on my own PhD research, not to do with the literature review, but actually to do with qualitative research, I found that kind of one major issue was to do with the enforcement of kind of regard or recognition of cyclists as legitimate road users, and as well insecure spaces that allow for these incidents of disregard to occur and kind of put people at risk or exposed to mainly people in cars. And then lastly then, increase enforcement. So I would say that if there was like one aspect of investment could be to increase enforcement, increase the spaces used that are protected, and thirdly then educate, I suppose, and try to make people more regarding road users, I suppose.
For me, Alison, I'm going to agree with Damien. I think there's been great work over the last 6 weeks of building temporary cycle lanes. So continue that, and the temporary cycle lanes that are working, move quickly to make them permanent.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that answer. So one from the very beginning there that we might all have different perspectives on. So sometimes there can be negative behavior towards cyclists. So how could we combat negative, maybe rage, negative comments or anything towards cyclists from motorists in Ireland?
Yeah, I can get the ball rolling here. I think the driver training curriculum could be revised completely so that there's a much greater emphasis on understanding, you know, how wide a berth to give a person on a bike if you're passing them, and just generally being more courteous to people walking and cycling, I think is a crucial part of it. I mean, in London, for heavy goods vehicle drivers, there were courses in which the drivers are required to go out on bikes, and they develop, you know, a much greater understanding of the good the road uses. So I would like to see that inscribed into the Road Safety Authority work. And like there was a new CEO appointed this week, so I would like to see him, you know, think about this as part of the new Road Safety Authority strategy.
Yeah, I suppose I'd agree with the training end of things and the education, like embedding it into how we train when we're driving, or people who are going to drive. And as well, I guess maybe there is an argument as well for more clear indications in public spaces. So it's very clear. Like, I like the cycle symbols that you get in mixed spaces like bus lanes, because it makes it very clear that cyclists are allowed to be in the middle there. So more kind of symbolism, I guess, that indicates that cyclists are fully entitled to use public spaces, and as well maybe enhancing those entitlements, like with the safe passing distance and stuff like that. Obviously difficult to enforce, but I think that general trend towards increasing liability, it could be a good way to look down and actually enforcing it then.
Great. Okay, so we're almost to the end of our time here, so I might take one more question, and then maybe we can answer questions over email, or because a lot of people have been asking for some of the images and some of the presentations, so we might be able to get that to people afterwards, and we can send out the recording too. So one last question maybe for everyone. What partnerships should cycling campaigns be trying to increase awareness with and support for cycling? So should local cycling campaigns be getting in touch with tidy towns? What kind of relationships should be built to support cycling?
Alison, I'll have a first go at that. So I think to increase awareness about the health benefits of cycling is beneficial. People are clearly more conscious about it. Gym memberships are growing all the time. So we do a partnership with the Irish Heart Foundation. So, you know, cardiovascular diseases, Robert covered those. So more and more partnerships. So it just really drives home that cycling is not just convenient in terms of time and money, but hugely beneficial in terms of, you know, personal health. So that would be my recommendation.
Robert, do you have thoughts on that?
No, you go ahead.
I agree with you. I think the health organisations are very important, and within Cyclist.ie, we have partnerships with some of the larger health promotion bodies. Schools is really important. So what Taisce Green Schools is doing, I think, is so important. I think universities, civil engineering and transport engineering, transport planning courses, I think all students should be leaving really with a much greater grasp of what types of conditions walkers and cyclists need, rather than just thinking about throughput for large metal boxes. So I think more strategic partnership with universities would be valuable. Tidy towns is also a good idea. I think that's one to have a think about as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. We still have 18 questions. Everyone has lots of questions, and I'd love for us to have time to answer them all live, but we might be able to get back to you with the answers. And there's such an appetite for this conversation, so we'll definitely be holding more webinars in the future to continue the conversation. So I'd like to thank Robbie, Hugh, and Damien for joining us today. Great information, really useful to everyone involved. And if there's anything you guys want to say goodbye or anything like that.
Thanks, Million. It was lovely to have the opportunity to catch up, and hopefully we can catch up in non-virtual space at some point during the year.
Yeah, hopefully soon.
Thanks for being Alison and Jessica.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. And just there's a few questions for me, and if people want to send them to Hugh at BleeperBike.com, it would be easier for me to reply there. So it's just Hugh at BleeperBike.com.
Yeah, you have lots of good ideas coming in for you there.
Yeah, thank you everyone for that.
Yeah.
And
Well, thanks so much. Yeah.
Yeah, if people want to contact me, they can go to the Cyclist.ie website or the Taisce website, and there are details there.
Super. All right. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon. Yeah.
Thanks, Allison.
Okay.